Hi, very good morning to everybody. May I please request everyone to settle? So, my name is Manvi Singh, and on behalf of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, I feel privileged to welcome you all to the very first Global Just Transition Dialogue, a conversation and engagement platform to discuss some of the most crucial issues concerning a just and inclusive energy transition. Over the next 2 days, we are joined by subnational, national, and international stakeholders to discuss matters of policies, plans, and financing for ensuring a just energy transition, particularly from a global south perspective. The discussions and outcomes of the convening are intended to inform India's Think 20 deliberations and complement the country's proactive engagement in support of clean energy transition, green growth, and the commitment towards climate action. I'm very thankful to the T20 Secretariat in supporting us with this. The discussions today are spread across 5 sessions. We begin with an inaugural session that will set the context for the 2 days of discussions that follow. Here, we are also happy to release two of our recent reports, which focus on just transition policies and costs. Later sessions will focus on international experience, the roles that national and state governments can and have to play in this, the policy imperatives to ensure just transition, and the financing needs with a focus again on the global south. I'm very happy to share that we're joined today by eminent guests and experts representing India's G20 presidency, national and state governments, industry, labor unions, philanthropies, think tanks, and other experts. We also welcome a very diverse representation from Global South countries, particularly South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Um, all the speakers will be introduced during the sessions, but the brochure for the event, which has the detailed speaker profiles, they can be scanned using the QR code which is available at the registration desk. I'm very happy to share also that we did receive a very overwhelming response to the event in terms of the registrations, but we had to limit confirmations because of the hall's capacity. Uh, but we do expect a packed hall as it already is, and a very engaging audience. We truly appreciate everybody's presence and look forward to enriched conversations and very meaningful discussions throughout the day. The dialogue will continue tomorrow as an expert roundtable and working group meeting to deliberate on principles and guidelines for just and inclusive energy transition. And before I begin the inaugural session, I just request everybody to put your phones on silent. Uh, I'll now sort of introduce our eminent guests for the inaugural session today. We are graced by the presence of Mr. Amitabh Kant, the G20 Sherpa, who is the chief guest for the event. We also have with us Dr. Shamika Ravi, who serves as member of the Economic Advisory Council to Prime Minister, Government of India. Mr. Ashok Lavasa is currently Vice President for Private Sector Operations and Public-Private Partnership at Asian Development Bank, and Ms. Louis Nodia, who serves as a Commissioner of Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa. Welcome, everybody. I now invite Mr. Chandrabhushan, President and Chief Executive Officer of iForest, to begin the dialogue.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today in this very exciting event, the first Global Just Transition Dialogue. Mr. Kant, Dr. Ravi, Luis, Mr. Lavasa, thank you for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. Our hope is that we will make the Global Just Transition Dialogue an annual event. Ladies and gentlemen, the IPCC's synthesis report was published a few days back on 20th of March. And interestingly, in IPCC's 4-decade-long history, just transition has figured prominently for the first time in this assessment report. And I believe the reason is that it is now widely recognized that solving climate crisis will need more than technology. It will require technology, of course, but it will also require socio-economic transition. And most importantly, fundamental changes in the political economy. Without these fundamental changes, we will not be able to rapidly deploy technologies that are developing today. Now, we are going to present two reports today, and those reports will touch upon some of the issues related to transition, including the kind of policies, plans, and financial requirements that is there to meet the just transition costs in Global South. By the way, we had planned to release 3 reports, but we could manage only 2. And the third, but I will present some of the key findings of the third report in my presentation as well. Now, before I discuss India, let me start by presenting an overview of what is happening worldwide on just transition. If you can start the presentation, please. Now, this is the global map of just transition. There are 16 countries who have policies or plan or both on just transition. And the focus of just transition today is on coal. In fact, there are very few countries who are looking at transition of oil and gas sector. Now, if you put all these countries together, they account for about 25% of global coal consumption. But if you consider the fact that China alone accounts for 50% of coal consumption, India about 12%, then all these countries more or less account for the remaining coal use in the world. So a significant part of the world has developed policies and plans on just transition. Most of them are in global north, but there are countries in the global south, especially Indonesia, South Africa, and Vietnam, who have got into just transition through Just Energy Transition Partnership deal that they have with G7 countries. Now, that was the national picture, but I think the most exciting things are happening at the sub-national level. We could count about 50 plus just transition plans being implemented across the world at the provincial level. Again, the majority is in Europe as territorial just transition plans being funded through European Commission Just Transition Fund, but there is policies being evolved and framework being implemented in the US, Canada. Of course, South Africa has come out with its own investment plan. So the exciting things are happening at the subnational level. Now, in the report that we are going to present to you today, we have also looked at what are the key learnings from these policies and plans. The first learning that comes out is that everyone is fundamentally looking at closing old mines and plants. That is the first phase of just transition. And then in the second phase, they are looking at closing newer facilities. But the first phase of just transition across the world is to close old mines, old thermal power plants, unprofitable establishments. Most countries have set up independent just transition commission or task force to develop policies. And the interesting part of just transition is that while the discussion happens on labor and skill, the major investments are going in economic diversification and community resilience to build new businesses. So we see from the global experience that just transition is certainly more than investment in labor. It's about economic restructuring as well. As far as labor is concerned, the need for a strong labor and social welfare policies are well recognized. In fact, we have examples of countries who have reformed their labor laws because of just transition. If you look at responsibilities, then there seems to be a clear division between what national governments are doing and what provincial governments are doing. Generally, national governments are responsible for providing the big framework as well as for mobilizing financial resources, whereas development of plan, implementation of plan is the responsibility of subnational governments. Another interesting learning from the global experience is that no country is giving responsibility to existing administrative mechanism to implement just transition. Dedicated systems are being set up at subnational level to implement just transition. And lastly, transition is about dialogue. It is about negotiation. It is about engagement. And that comes out quite clearly from the global experience. Now, this was about policy and plan. What about money? From where is the money coming? And we have studied 6 major coal regions of the world to understand the cost factor and cost component of just transition. We have looked at 2 in Europe, Lusatia in Brandenburg, Germany, Silesia in Poland, Mpumalanga in South Africa, and three major coal districts of India, Ramgarh, Angul, and Korba. Now, what comes out is that you can actually distill the cost of just transition into 8 cost components. These are mine reclamation and repurposing. Land is precious, and countries and governments are investing money to reclaim that land and repurpose that land. Decommissioning cost of thermal power plant, labor support and transition, economic diversification, community resilience, green energy investment to compensate for loss of energy infrastructure, revenue substitution, and energy price support. Many fossil fuel regions, in many fossil fuel regions, industries get subsidized energy that have to be compensated for, and planning and governance. Now, our review shows that while we can come out with some cost factors, the financial packages are a negotiated outcome. There's a deep negotiation that is happening between labor union and national government, between national government and provincial governments. And the investment, therefore, are highly region specific, and rightly so, because no coal region is similar in nature. Now, this was the global overview on what is happening on just transition. But what about India? What can we do in India? What kind of policy and financing mechanism we can set in place for just transition? Do we need to actually start talking about just transition? There's a general belief in this country is that it's too early to discuss just transition. Now, I beg to differ simply because there is no one just transition reality of India. We have divided the coal districts of India into 3 distinct categories. This is category number 1. These are low significance districts. They produce very little coal, they have low productivity, they count for about 5% of the mine. These are 13 districts, coal districts of India, sprinkled across the map of the country. The second category is high significance district. These are high producing, high productivity district. 21 districts, they produce about 80% of India's coal. They account for 1/4 of mines, and they also have 1/4 of thermal power capacity. These are the coal mine thermal power hub of the country. And closure of mines and plants in these districts will have regional impacts. So these districts will need regional just transition plan and not just district plans. But the point here is, in none of these districts, coal mines are closing in next 10 years. We will witness closure happening only after 10 years. So this is the second category, the second reality of coal industry in the country. But this is the third reality, the high priority district. These are the old coal fields of India where coal mining is happening for more than 100 years. Mines are already closing in these districts because of reserve depletion or unprofitability. These are 17 districts producing about 20% of country's coal and lignite. They have 70% mine, more than 60% workforce. They have large fleet of old thermal power plants, and they are already experiencing the impact of closure. Now, these are the districts where we have to start thinking about just transition now. In fact, we should have thought about it a few years back. But nevertheless, these districts are districts where just transition planning should happen now if we do not want large-scale socio-economic disruptions. So this is the new geography of coal district of India. And I think we should be teaching it in classrooms now. These are 51 districts with capacity to produce 1.3 billion ton coal, have 88 gigawatt of thermal capacity, and have 5.26 million formal, informal, and induced workers. These are our calculation which we are going to release today. Now, we have to think about just transition with these realities and 2 targets that we have. The first target is the net zero target of 2070, but there is another goal which we talk about it, but we are not actually paying a lot of attention about that goal, which is energy independence by 2047. Now, this means that at the 100th year of India's independence, we would like to reduce or absolutely eliminate our dependence on imported fossil fuel. Now, if you take the reality of India and the goals, then this should be the strategy for just transition. Unlike the Western world, which is focusing on phasing down coal first, we should be thinking about all the fossil fuels together. Oil, gas, and coal. We don't have to only focus on coal. Second, But we should learn from them in terms of how they have been successful in planning the transition in phased manner. And we should also follow a phased approach to transition. We have old and unprofitable coal mines, about 50%, 200 plus mines, 30 gigawatt of old power plants, and automobile sector where rapid technological transition is happening right away, right now. And also thanks to Mr. Kant and his work at Niti Aayog. And this is where we will need a lot of work on transitioning and skilling aspect of transition. As far as framework is concerned, we have taken the what is there in Constitution of India. And if you look at Constitution of India, then there is very clear division of powers and roles between the state and the union government. Of course, union government has much larger role to play in just transition, but there is specific role for the states as well. In fact, economic growth, industrial development, land and forests are state subjects. So we will need separate framework on just transition at the state level, but as well as at the union level. In fact, the labor aspect of just transition is in concurrent list, which is everything related to socio-economic planning, labor dispute, welfare of labor, social security, insurance, everything is in the concurrent list. Our recommendation for national policy is that we should also set up an independent commission or task force to formulate policy. The national policy and national framework should be about interministerial and interstate coordination, mobilizing national and international finance, transitioning of central public sector enterprise. In fact, one of the big challenge of just transition will be how do we transition and diversify our central public sector enterprises. And then reforms in land, labor, and mining and forestry laws that will be required. State, of course, should also set up a task force, and we have an example of Jharkhand where the first task force has been set up. They should think about developing a comprehensive state and district plan, integrating just transition in their policies and plan, establishing a dedicated institution, because we also think that the current capacity of district administration will not be able to handle it, and then get into negotiation. Just transition is about negotiations. How much it will cost? It will cost us about $900 billion only in coal and thermal power district. And we are no different. A large majority of that investment will go in economic diversification and building the new infrastructure and industries in coal district. About a third of this will have to come from grant and subsidy and public finance. We can think about $600 billion of private investment, but a third of this will have to come from public finance. And therefore, the key message that we want to give it to you today from our work on just transition is, first of all, there is no contradiction between increasing coal consumption in India and implementing just transition in certain part of the country. We will see increase in coal consumption for the next couple of years. Technological transition, which is happening rapidly, without a planned just transition will lead to suboptimal outcome. And one of the outcomes could be increased poverty and development deficit in coal areas, which are already, by the way, in the list of aspirational districts. These are the poor districts of the country. International partnership will be important to mobilize financial resources. And we already have significant resource. I and Mr. Lavasa was talking today about District Mineral Foundation Fund. Every year it collects about $1 billion. And about 60% of these are in coal districts. We also have coal cess, $5 billion every year, which is going for GST compensation cess. So resources, there are enough resources within the country to start implementing just transition. And this is the last message, that just transition is about 6 Rs. Restructuring of economy, repurposing of land and infrastructure, reskilling, skilling of workforce and workforce transition, resilient communities, revenue substitution, and responsible social and environmental practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bhushan. May I now invite our eminent guest to please release the report, Shrestha, and the research team also involved in this process, Vagisha and please.
Two reports, right? One more report is there. Unnecessary. Yeah, clapping would be nice.
Thank you, everyone. May I now invite Mr. Kant to please make his address? You could do it from there also.
Let me first compliment Mr. Chandrabhushan for this wonderful two reports on the Just Transition Framework. Let me speak from there. Let me first compliment Mr. Chandrabhushan and iForest for these two wonderful reports on Just Transition Framework for India. And one on policies, plans, and institutional mechanisms, and one is a decomposition study. And these will go a long way in giving us a better understanding and a much better comprehension on how to undertake a just transition in India, and also give us a global perspective of what's happening across the world at both the national and subnational level. I've been a long-term believer that just transition is not just about phasing down of fossil fuel infrastructure. It's also about jobs, it's also about growth, and it's also about sustainability. It's also important to understand that electricity in India is just 20% of our energy requirement. And even if we were to do 100% renewable, 80% of our energy comes from hard to abate sectors like refineries, steel, cement, long distance transport, which are very critical. Now, most of us in the emerging markets also realize that we are not responsible for carbonizing the world. If the world has to limit itself to 1.5 degrees centigrade, we are running out of space, carbon space, and therefore it's imperative that all of us undertake just transition. While we've not contributed to carbonizing the world, it's also important that in due course India will become, today we occupy just 1.5% of the carbon space out of the 2,800 gigatons of carbon space available. We occupy just 1.5 at 1.5 degree centigrade. We occupy just 1.5%. Logically, India should be entitled to about 18.5% based on its per capita. But irrespective of that, as we industrialize, we'll soon become the third most carbonizing country in the world. And therefore, the challenge for India is to become the first country in the world to industrialize without carbonizing. That is a challenge which India has taken upon itself, both at COP21 in Paris and later in the vision of the Prime Minister through Panchamrit in Glasgow. We are also the first country which was able to achieve its NDC target 9 years ahead of schedule. We do about 172 gigawatts of renewable. And while we are pushing for all this, it's also important to understand that it will not be politically feasible, as Mr. Chandrabhushan has said, because it impacts jobs and livelihoods. In many of these areas, unless, to my mind, we are not able to economically drive down the prices of renewables very sharply. And that would mean that, to my mind, access to the best possible technologies and our ability to source funding at low rates of interest. So, my belief is that India is climatically blessed. No other country in the world, other than probably Saudi Arabia or one or two other countries, have the similar kind of climatic conditions as India has. So, India has a huge potential for doing renewables. But I was analyzing the bid of Saudi Arabia. Our lowest bid has been 0.02 kilowatt per hour. Saudi Arabia got, when comparative terms you look at it, Saudi got even a lower bid than that. And I was analyzing these two bids. The only difference between Saudi's much lower bid and India's bid was the rate of interest. In Saudi, it was dollar denominated tariff at 1.5%. In India, it was at about 8.5%. So the challenge, to my mind, is our ability to source funding at lower rates of interest, because India's climatic conditions are very good and India's entrepreneurship is top class. They will drive the just transition. The private sector of India will drive the just transition, as they've done in renewables. But our ability, they will go and get the best technology, as they've done in many other areas, and they've done it in renewables, they're doing it in green hydrogen. But our ability to get financing at low cost is a key component there. And there the challenge is that the developed world, which had committed to $100 billion a year in 2009, has not lived up to its commitments at all. But irrespective of that, there's no shortage of funds, to my mind. There are vast pools of institutional funds available. There are insurance funds, pension funds, all of them want to invest. And actually, I'm a believer that values of companies and values of countries and the ability to attract capital will go up only if they go digital and go green. And therefore, we should push, and we are pushing, and our young enterprise is all pushing for it, but our ability to attract private capital is greatly impacted. Our ability to push for just transition gets badly impacted because the risks of sourcing private fund in Asia, in Africa, are very different from the risks in the developed part of the world. And therefore, it's important to pool these risks together and also to be able to bring in new instruments of lending, whether it's blended finance, whether it's credit enhancement, whether it's first loss guarantees. And I think, therefore, I'm a believer that if you want to push the South and the emerging markets towards just transition, it's very important that the multilateral financial institutions and all these other institutions were created. They were created in the post-World War II era, the post-Bretton Woods period. They're not designed for climate change, nor are they designed for SDG goals. And therefore, you need these institutions to do more of indirect financing rather than direct financing, and must be able to leverage their equity base for much greater level of financing to be able to assist and support entrepreneurs and enable them to be able to bring down the cost of just transition. Without their ability to bring down the cost of just transition, it'll be very difficult, even if you push for all these policy measures, even if the government pushes for all these policy measures. So I'm a great believer that the ability to provide low-cost financing over a long period of time, because hedging instruments are not available, They're available for 2-3 years. You need hedging instruments of about 25 to 30 years, which is very critical. And even if we do 100% renewable on our electricity, it's the balance 80% of uh, the hard to abate sectors, which is very critical. And unless we do about 180 billion worth of fossil fuel imports, and the last slide which Mr. Chandrabhushan brought out is about making India fossil fuel independent, which the Prime Minister talked about in his independence speech last year. And the way forward for that, and the way forward is much like the development of the world was driven by coal and by oil in the last century. The development of the emerging markets has to be driven by a completely new fuel, which is green hydrogen. And for that to happen, you need to bring down the cost of renewables, to my mind, to almost about 50% of its present lowest bids which have come in India. And then to be able to make a country like India the lowest cost producer, the lowest exporter of green hydrogen and its liquid form ammonia to the rest of the world. And there, to my mind, India has great opportunity, not only because it has great climatic conditions, but because it has great capacity and capability to do pump storage. I'm a believer that the answer to the lowest cost of producing green hydrogen lies in your ability to combine wind, solar, and pump storage together. Pump storage, because the cost of production of 24/7 renewables with storage, it then becomes about 40% cheaper than battery storage. You're not import dependent on lithium, nickel, and cobalt. And India has huge geography to do pump storage on a very large scale through private sector. And therefore, wind, solar combined with pump storage is really the answer to bringing down the cost of green hydrogen to $2.5 per kilogram in the next 3 years and bringing it down to $1 per kilogram in the next by 2030. And that is really the alternative to a new fuel for the world. And that is the answer for just transition, to my mind. But let me tell you that will not happen. That will not happen simply because the Western part of the world, which has advocated free trade for a long time through its Inflation Reduction Act and CHIP Act, have produced the most protectionist piece of literature ever written in the world. And the Inflation Reduction Act talks about giving $3 per kilogram subsidy to green hydrogen produced in the United States of, as long as you make it in the United States of America, even if the cost of production in the United States of America is $7.5 per kilogram as compared to $4.5 per kilogram in India. And therefore, this is not, you need to open up, talk about, these are countries which have talked about globalization. These are countries which have talked about free trade and are preaching and are actually implementing protectionism as far as new fuels of the world are concerned and as far as decarbonizing the world are concerned. And therefore, just transition cannot take place as far as these countries practice protectionism instead of free trade. And these, to my mind, requires a very open mind for opening up the world to produce green hydrogen at the lowest cost, bring down the cost of renewables, demonopolize supplies, ensure that the cost of production falls very rapidly, because size and scale is important, and only size and scale will enable just transition to take place. And therefore, to my mind, in emerging markets like India, it's about jobs, it's about growth, it's about sustainability. We are blessed with climatic conditions. We have top-class entrepreneurship. We can do it. But I think you need a global structural reforms for financing, and you need to move away from protectionism to be able to enable it to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you for highlighting some of the fundamental imperatives of just transition going forward.
Really sorry, my apologies. I'm caught up in a G20 meeting, so I'll have to rush up. Sincere apologies.
We have a small. Yes, sir.
May I now request Dr. Shamika Ravi to please make her address?
Good morning, namaskar, everyone. Well, let me start out by first saying that, of course, I'm going to bring the economist's lens to this concern. I think there are two key things that the report also highlights largely, but also what the Sherpa just mentioned and reiterated a few times. There are two things happening which make India's ambition for green transition particularly troublesome and difficult. One is, and they're both to do with the opportunity cost of number one, we perhaps are amongst the poorest countries attempting to make this very significant transition at such low levels of per capita income. If you look at the ambition and the targets that we are committing ourselves to, it is very important to understand that the opportunity cost for a low middle income country to make these commitments is much higher than it is for a richer country or for a middle income country. So we are trying to do all of this and incur these transitions and these costs at levels which are low, and that needs to be reiterated because low income levels mean that there will be it's their own set of political economic consideration. And the second is, in the last 10 years, largely stemming from the US China trade war, but now increasingly because of course what is happening in Europe, you're also seeing that the global supply chain and the value chain, the way it is under disruption, is also adding to a lot of anti globalization movements across countries, which means the kind of protectionist policies that Mr. Khan spoke about, one has to battle those as well. And cost of capital, of course, becomes a very key component in that. So, and we don't know what the end game of the European situation right now is, but that disruption is likely to only continue in the near foreseeable future. So we'll have to find solutions out of that. Now, three core points beyond the context that I just laid out that I'd like to focus on is one, and I see this often with, first of all, congratulations on the report. I think this is the first time I'm seeing a coherent strategy emerge in terms of a dollar value. And of course, the dollar value is significant compared to the 100 billion, which was the collective commitment of the richer nations, and we of course want 9 times that amount. So it just tells you the gap between what is required and what is available, and also the gap between pledge and eventually cash that we are seeing happen at the international level. So first is, while there is an emerging strategy and there is clarity around it, when we say retrain labor or it is a problem, we are seeing country after country where the aftermath of the distributional impact of globalization, you're seeing that there is a movement away from free trade. There are countries which are seeing emergence of right-wing economic policies on account of the fact that the distribution impacts of globalization are very real. It's not easy to retrain and re-employ people away from sectors that they are committed to or used to. So it's not just the fixed cost in terms of policy intervention, it is really time consuming. The transformation we want in terms of retraining, reallocating labor force is a very real concern, and it's not going to be a very easy fix. I think that is going to become one of our sticking points, particularly because we have struggled with labor laws. Governments after governments have continued to struggle in reforming labor laws. So you can imagine that trying to move away and retrain a large chunk of workers, particularly across districts which are aspirational districts. So these are some of our worst performing in terms of development districts. So in those places, the tensions are going to be that much more. The second is in terms of the financing instruments themselves. I think while we know we have some clarity, these are back of the envelope calculations, I know, and that is where we have to begin. But we have to get far more into the details of what will be the nature of the financial instruments required to deploy these kind of finances. So, for instance, if we are talking about green bonds, or what is green finance? The lexicon and exactly what construes green finance, even globally, we have to develop that clarity in terms of classifying, measuring, and then eventually indexing it to the different instruments that we are interested in. And I think that becomes like the first stepping stone. It's a baby step, but there is no moving beyond that in terms of implementation if we do not all agree on the details of what construes green finance. So we need to get into the details of developing the language, developing the financial language in terms of then operationalizing what are top level commitments and requirements. The third point that is of a greater concern and something that I have been working on for some time now is the energy security itself. All major economies, it's not only now, and it hasn't just started with the COP conversations. Major economies like US and China have been attempting to wean away from imports for some time now. This has been a 2-decade long conversation, and the US has brought it down to about 9% of its total energy consumption dependent on exports, and China has also now stabilized it around 15-16%. Now, for India, which is, of course, the poorest amongst these major economies, our dependence is around 35-36%, which is a very large number, and we show no sign of stagnating. So our energy dependence on imports continues to rise on account of the fact that we are a $2,200 per capita per annum economy. So, an economy at this phase of growth is going to be hungry and energy hungry, and we will have to do what it takes to meet those energy demands. So, one has to understand the pressures of energy security with the added aspirations and pressures of the green transition that we are attempting to make. Now, one small point, just adding to when Mr. Chandrabhushan mentioned that a lot of action is happening in the states. In fact, we are concluding a survey of 8,000 firms, largely because I think at the Delhi level, there is a conversation which I think is converging on certain key factors. I think we all agree, and this is a little bit like preaching to the choir. But the real action in terms of operationalizing a lot of these policies, it's happening at the state level. Now, it's not happening at every state level. Some states are far more proactive. In fact, the survey that we are doing based on the annual survey of industries, that's the framework we are using, because we do want representation of not just large, but we want to look at the small and medium enterprises as well. That might be due to the incentives that the state governments are giving or the central government giving. Are they investing into this kind of a transition? And the early findings basically tell us that almost all the action is really concentrated in 5 or 6 states of the country. So a lot of what nationally we are trying to aspire, I think a lot of those conversations, at least from the transitioning at the firm level, is concerned. And I'm not talking about energy sector. I'm talking about MSMEs and large firms and what kind of investments they are making to transition towards greener technology and towards renewable and away from fossil fuels, etc. A lot of action is in 5 to 6 states. That is number one. Number two, on a more positive note, there is a bottom up approach that several states are taking as well. That while Delhi has these larger national ambition and aspirations, we have a poor state like Madhya Pradesh basically conducting a district by district measure of the green cover or the biodiversity cover. And this is being done through the Indian Institute of Forest Management with help from international scholars, etc. But the idea is that eventually, if you don't have a good measure of what the green cover at the local level is, which is what the valuable asset here is, and this is what we want to index in terms of then raising green finance or indexing it to carbon footprints, etc. We have to start by at least measuring what the lay of the land is. So Madhya Pradesh has started to do this exercise a year and a half back, and we are hoping to have a good measure at the district level in another 6 to 7 months. I know that the state of Meghalaya, again in the northeast, is doing a very similar exercise in terms of mapping its green cover, because again, the idea is to raise finance against it and be able to deploy it at the local level. I don't know how many of you in the room are aware, India is perhaps one of the very few countries, perhaps the second country, to have a social stock exchange, which means we are developing institutions which will help us deploy, first of all, raise and deploy capital. So it is not a regular stock exchange where instruments are traded. This becomes a place where there is a matching of the supply and demand for green finance. And there is also a development. When I talk about lexicon, we are trying to develop a coherent a dictionary for what green finance ought to be and how do we measure in terms of attaining some of these objectives? What are the exact indicators that we have to measure and scrutinize and audit from a longer term perspective? So my time is up. I just wanted to get into some of the weeds and the details of the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ravi. May I now invite Mr. Lavasa to please make his address?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think we heard an excellent presentation giving an overview of what's happening in the world, what's happening in India, what is it that we are required to do, what is the scale of the problem. And then Mr. Kant laid out the complexity of the whole issue, and very ably Shamika pointed out some of the encouraging initiatives that are going on at the state level, at the district level. So I think all these things put together, they go to prove one thing, and that is that just transition, or by whatever name you want to call it, is not going to be an easy exercise. And therefore, I think this conference that has been organized, this dialogue that has been organized, assumes greater significance, greater relevance. And I'm particularly happy that Dr. Chandrabhushan, whom I've known for several years, continues to do the good work that he was doing earlier. And he's a friend of environment. And I think we need more friends of environment than people who are simply beneficiaries of the resources that nature provides, and they have a narrow utilitarian perspective towards nature. So I think that also is a part of the transition that we need to talk about, which is the transition in man's relationship with nature. And this transition, I think, is something that should lead to a transformation in the entire approach that humanity has towards natural resources. So I am extremely delighted to be here, and I am happy that I have this opportunity to represent the Asian Development Bank and provide the perspective from the ADB's side. Before I get into some of the details of what I want to say, I just want to touch upon one of the points which Mr. Kant mentioned, that it requires, the entire effort requires the multilateral organizations and other financial institutions to raise the level of their contribution, raise the level of their ambition. And I just want to share with you that the Asian Development Bank in December of 2021 at the Glasgow Summit announced that it will raise its climate financing goals from $80 billion between 2019 and 2030 to $100 billion during this period. So it's a significant increase in the ambition that ADB has for providing climate finance. The significant part of this is that $35 billion of this 100 need to go for adaptation, which I think so far remains a neglected area. And the other part is that about $12 billion of this would be provided for private sector, in the expectation that this $12 billion could leverage up to $30 billion from the market, the leveraging aspect which was touched upon earlier. So I just thought I'll share this with you. Now, what all of us witnessed in the last 50 years is that Asia and the Pacific has made huge development gains. Life expectancy has doubled. Infant mortality rate has fallen more than 70%, and per capita GDP has risen about 80-fold. However, the environmental impact of this model of growth that the region has emulated from countries that have achieved economic prosperity in the past continues to threaten the future. But now is the decade for action, and the Asia Pacific will be a key battleground for 4 reasons. First, the region is currently responsible for more than half of the global annual carbon dioxide emissions. And in the absence of new policies, These emissions are projected to increase by 16% relative to 2010 levels by 2030. Second, while energy consumption has spurred economic growth and lifted millions of people out of extreme poverty, the region remains home to two-thirds of the world's poor. Moreover, despite substantial improvements in electrification, energy poverty remains a daunting challenge, with 150 million people still without access to electricity in the region. Third, the region is exposed to various climate and weather related hazards. The unprecedented heat waves in India, tropical cyclones in the Philippines, floods in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and droughts across Central and South Asia are recent examples. And fourth, development gaps such as gender inequality, weak social protection, limited access to basic services also exacerbate the vulnerability. They also limit the capacity to adapt and consequently increase disaster risks. Between 1991 and 2020, disasters affected 5.6 billion people in the region and incurred over $1.5 trillion in physical and economic damages. Now, let's examine the positive trends. The cost of renewable energy and energy storage are coming down drastically, even if there is a scope for it to go down further. And soon we hope green hydrogen production technologies will be available at scale and at affordable prices. As countries embark on an energy transition at scale, they must contend with many challenges. These include access to affordable financing, lack of institutions that can deploy financing effectively in new low carbon growth areas, and technology risks. However, there are other challenges that are only recently becoming evident and whose far reaching impacts and mitigation measures are less understood. One key challenge is ensuring a just transition so that it is fair and inclusive as possible for everyone concerned. It should also be able to create opportunities for all and leave nobody behind. In this regard, ADB has signed onto a set of multilateral development bank just transition high level principles to articulate a common understanding of MDB support for just transition and guide MDB policies and activities. ADB also continues its engagements and consultations with developing member countries for incorporating the just component in the transition. The challenge, however, is how do we implement the just component and how do we convince stakeholders on the energy side and the just side to deliver a timely, efficient energy transition that truly has the just components embedded as a driver. And I think many of the issues were highlighted by all the three speakers. And I think we need to find ways in which they can be incorporated and addressed as we move forward. Now, just transition planning and implementation are multi-decade efforts that will require robust information on the domestic contexts, socio-economic impacts of the transition, needs and capacities of affected stakeholders, and feasibility of interventions. The reports that have been brought out, I think, serve very good purpose in this regard. To do this, ADB launched a Just Transition support platform at COP27. The Just Transition support platform is translating these high-level principles into concrete support, consistent with its priorities and mandates and the needs of its respective member countries. At COP26, ADB launched the Climate Action Catalyst Fund to support our DMCs to mobilize carbon finance through the purchase of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes or carbon credits. Couple of other noteworthy initiatives of ADB in the context of energy transition include the Energy Transition Mechanism, ETM as it is popularly called, and this is to accelerate the move out of coal to clean energy. ETM advances replicable and scalable market based mechanisms that take advantage of low cost capital from various concessional, public, and private sources to incentivize the early retirement or repurposing of coal fired power plants, while also unleashing new investments in clean energy, grid, and storage. The other one is the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility. Now, let me focus briefly on India's energy transition that is underway. The government is to be congratulated for announcing a series of new, very ambitious programs like the Green Hydrogen Mission, the Green Power Corridors, the Govardhan program, and support for scaling up battery energy storage. And also, India has made energy transition a central theme of G20 presidency. India's long-term development strategy also makes it clear that achieving net zero must be done in a way that supports India's priorities of poverty eradication, increasing employment, and reaching a new level of prosperity. For this to happen, a just transition is essential to not only ensure socio-economic impacts are identified, but more importantly, to ensure that the transition takes advantage of India's potential to build human and social capital, foster entrepreneurship, and attract investment. In the coming decades, as the country transitions away from a reliance on coal to wind, solar, biomass, pumped storage, and other forms of renewable energy and storage, we will see the altering of existing occupations in terms of task compositions, structural changes, and a transformation of existing jobs and a requirement of new skills. Recognizing this, let me highlight a specific initiative that ADB is designing in India. Skills development measures are integral to enable individuals and communities to be future ready. In India's case, the good news is that the government has already put in place resources and institutions that can be leveraged to initiate work on supporting the just transition, including skills development. The DMF, which Chandrabhushan spoke about, was introduced in 2015 as a benefit sharing scheme with mining affected communities. Its utilization, in keeping with its objects and purpose, could contribute significantly to the human development of the affected families and upgrade their skill sets to equip them for benefiting from emerging employment opportunities. As a crucial element of its support for the country's energy transition, ADB is partnering with the Ministry of Skills Development and Entrepreneurship to develop a just transition worker support facility for coal mining reliant districts and states. The facility will provide a structured approach through physical and virtual means and integrate existing resources across skilling and reskilling, entrepreneurship, livelihood development, and relevant social protection initiatives to make available bespoke assistance. The states will have access to a one-stop provider and curator of solutions for planning or implementation of skilling and livelihood programs. Through an effective skills development program, countries can ensure that they avoid creating an energy transition divide and instead ensure a just transition. Let me end by saying that ADB envisions a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia Pacific, and just transition is integral to realizing this vision. ADB is committed to just transition because it's the right thing to do. It is necessary for accelerating climate action, and it is also an opportunity to realize social goals such as decent work, poverty eradication, and gender equity. It is also strategic for ADB because enabling a just transition not only helps address physical climate risks and manage reputational risk, but it also makes business sense. I hope that you share my optimism in our collective ability to transform our societies and economies to be more just, equitable, resilient, and sustainable. I also hope that you are equally committed to ensuring that these transformations will not leave anyone behind, neither countries nor communities. Let me conclude by quoting the famous Indian saint Kabir, who said, "काल करे सो आज करे सो अब, पल में परलय होएगी, बहुरी करेगा कब," which simply means what you have to do tomorrow, please do it today. What you have to do today, do it now, because you never know when the end will come. Unfortunately for us, climate change is not a catastrophe that will happen at a future appointed date, after the world fails to meet its climate goals. It is a steady and visible threat enveloping us. It's a fight that must be fought on many fronts and continuously. The future is now. Just transition is a strategic approach that will allow us to keep gearing up as we continue to grow. And other than the 6 R's that Chandrabhushan mentioned, I think there is one more R which is at the heart of all this, and that is the resolve to act. And therefore, I look forward to the sessions and encourage all the delegates to actively participate in the dialogue to find constructive ways of moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. May I now request Ms. Louise to please make her address?
Good morning, everyone. It really is a privilege and an honor to be here amongst such illustrious company, both on the platform and amongst yourselves. And I must say, I think that after Dr. Lavasa's address and the booklet that's just come out, the publication, the section in there on South Africa is very good. So between those two, I don't know that I have very much to tell you anymore. Okay, so let's start. I think, Dr. Lavasa, thank you very much for bringing our attention to the fact that we are in a period of human history where fundamental changes are being imposed upon us by biophysical climate change impacts, but also the opportunity for us to really reshape the world and the way we run it and how we conduct ourselves in it and the outcomes we deliver for people and other species is possible at this time. So, you know, I've had the privilege to live through a period of history in my country where we managed to overthrow an oppressive regime. I now have the privilege to be in this phase of human history where we really can grasp with both hands the opportunity to remake the world. And in WWF South Africa, my day job, I work for WWF South Africa, and I am deployed by the president of our country to be a presidential climate change commissioner, which is a commission with the mandate to facilitate and convene the just transition in South Africa. So WWF South Africa has this slogan, I suppose you call it, that we all work under, called Food, Water and Energy for All, Forever. And the for all encapsulates both humans and the other species that we share the planet with. So it's food, water, and energy for all, forever, implying that we need to do this in a sustainable manner so that we don't deplete the resources that the world offers us. And I think that's quite a useful, it just captures the challenge before us quite succinctly. So I'm going to tell you a bit of the story of how we even came to the just transition concept in South Africa. I think it was after the COP15 in Copenhagen. This idea of a just transition was floating around in civil society and labor circles and came home with, our participants from that COP. Through our labor persons, through our civil society persons. And I think from then on, we were starting to think about that idea and so on. Then in about 2009, WWF got together with a labor research service organization called Naledi. And, we sort of started to say, well, what is it that labor is going to do about this transition? And don't you need to start considering climate change? And that it was a research service for the biggest trade union federation in South Africa called COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. They have about 500,000 members. And from that small seed, this whole concept has grown. And because it was initially led by labor, of course, it has a very strong emphasis on, what are we going to do about workers in the coal supply chains, particularly, and other fossil fuels. But it has not stuck there. In South Africa, our concept of a just transition is quite encompassing. We see it as, a chance to transform society in a whole lot of dimensions. The country faces a triple challenge of unemployment. We have about 35% unemployment. We have extreme poverty in our country. I'm sure in this room, many of those things echo for you as well. We have extreme poverty, and we have the worst Gini coefficient in the world. So we have the filthy rich and the filthy poor. And, I don't use the word filthy in a sense of insulting the people. I mean that the condition of poverty is unacceptable to anybody with any decency. So we looked at, can we address these triple challenges with the transition? And can we address things like gender equality and other social ills? Gender-based violence is ubiquitous in South Africa. So we're looking at a transition which really creates a kind of new world. And then our National Planning Commission developed a Vision 2030 and a National Development Plan. And a strong element in there was this whole idea of a just transition. And it's a just transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. So we're picking up on both dimensions, not just the energy sector. So and even on the decarbonization side of our transition, we don't just look at energy, we're looking at all high emitting sectors. I use this term mitigation. I don't think that as of yesterday, anything human beings do should not consider both, is this at least climate neutral on the mitigation side, if not better than climate neutral, but at least we can't be doing anything that is taking us on a path of increasing emissions. And is it adaptive? Is it climate resilient? We've got to think about both of those things all the time and not silo them, which they sometimes are. Okay, so our National Planning Commission then ran a process called the Pathways for a Just Transition. And very soon, the commissioner who was running that project realized that we are always in rooms talking to business and government. We don't go down to the people. And so they really had a process. You have states, we have provinces. They went to every single province and they tried to speak to communities on the ground and to workers on the ground. And what they came up with at the end is that we need to address water, land use and food, and energy access for all. So those are the sort of guiding lights for our transition. Then along comes the commission that I'm part of, the Climate Commission. In South Africa, we have almost in our post-apartheid DNA, this idea that you must build social compacts. So we have an institution called NEDLAC, where government, business, labor, and civil society have representation, and any one of those parties can call the others to come and discuss an issue of economic importance or labor importance. Anyway, so they had a job summit discussion trying to address the unemployment in the country and how to create more jobs. And in the framework agreement that came out of that summit was this concept of you need to establish a high-level commission to facilitate and convene, excuse me, the just transition. So the president then appointed the commission, and in that same culture of trying to develop a social compact, the commissioners are drawn from every sector. There's commissioners from business, from labor, myself from civil society, with many others from civil society. And all our ministers, the ministers are all de facto commissioners. So, the attempt is to bring the highest government decision makers into the room right at the beginning and have those discussions. Because, of course, I'm sure this is the case everywhere. The department and the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy that does not necessarily have the same agenda as the Department of Environment. And those contradictions in government where people are not always all pulling in the same direction are precisely, what the commission has to work with and try and get consensus about. So I hope you wish us luck, and I expect to have many discussions with a lot of you through the 2 days so that we can help each other solve some of these issues. Thank you.
We can quickly have 2 questions. We are already past our time, but 2 questions from the audience. If there's one at the back. No comments. Please keep it short and do introduce yourself very quickly.
My name is Aminish Manoj and I'm a college student. So coming from the southern side of India, my question is, when you are talking about the climate change and the things that we want to do, like the focus on renewable energy and all, can you tell your views on the project the government of India is planning on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, like the Great Nicobar? Can you please comment on that? Because you are cutting trees and making it an international port. So what is your comment on that?
I'm sorry, I don't think anyone of us are going to comment on that, because from iForest we have not studied it, but if there is any comment any of the panelists would like to make. Yeah, you can.
No, I don't speak on behalf of the government. Let me make it very clear here. But I think it alludes to I know there is a larger anguish around these projects. And I think that is your question. And that question is very well appreciated. But what you have to, I think the best answer one can look for a question like that is, the trade-offs that we've all been speaking about, that I definitely highlighted, that for a country of our level of income, our level of poverty and our development challenges, growth will always, so the energy security uh, and the economic security, I think, will always be at every step of the way. There will be a tension between that and the larger green aspirations we have. But then, just as in South Africa, we have the same issue. Environment Ministry has one goal, and of course, other ministries, in this case, it could be infrastructure, will have its own goal. We have our aspirations. So that conflict is going to remain project after project. But I think the best bet in today's day and age is to find that common ground and be able to mitigate as much of the distortions caused as cheaply and as fast as possible. That is our best bet.
Thank you. One more quick question.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Vishwak. I'm from the School of Public Policy at IIT Delhi. And Dr. Ravi, I have a question for you. You had mentioned that in Madhya Pradesh they're mapping biodiversity from using a bottom-up inventorization kind of approach. I just wanted to know. So there are other statutory bodies like the biodiversity management committees, which are at the local level, which have been doing this kind of work. So I wanted to understand, how do you kind of map out these competencies that already exist at the local level in different institutions to bring them together for these kind of objectives?
That's a very reassuring question. Partly because you see a lot of the effort that Delhi makes, or in this case, let's say Bhopal makes, let's say if we are talking about a specific state or a province, then it is almost never an exercise done by the CMO itself or by one institute. This is a very large collaboration. And the district officials across different departments are engaged in this mapping. In fact, the aspiration is a little beyond. We really want to crowdsource a lot of this information. So we also want the general janta to be a party to that, particularly as far as biodiversity is concerned. You really want to use new age tools and methods, and it's a hugely consultative and sort of a inclusive process. But it's good that there are local level institutions which have been tasked with some of these. But a lot of that data, even if it exists, it is dated, and you'll be surprised how much data, while they might be required to collect, is not getting collected, right? So now that you have a new usage for it, the attempt is to now be able to have a real-time measures. Okay, we can raise finances against the green cover. There is a sense of urgency and a sense for precision, which is driving this. Thank you.
Thank you. One more.
Can I have one question?
No, sorry, who was? But we
Well,
do have a tea break after this, and we'll get
it's
an
just a small
opportunity to
intervention
sort
on
of-
the
Okay.
aspect which Shamita
Please go
Ravi
ahead.
had raised. Yeah, you referred about a balance between growth as well as the environment. So as we have progressed a lot in terms of our research initiatives and environmental aspects, can we have geographical location specific ceilings in terms of development ceilings so that the balance is maintained? I'm talking about geographical locations because yes, we have a lot of diversity. Taking that thing into consideration and the local development that may have been done, so can we create such type of scenario and maybe some research initiatives, and then policies should comply to that? Your thought. Thank you.
It's an easier academic and research exercise than it will be at the level of implementation. And the reason I say this, the current tension that we have between, let's say, the OECD countries or the G7 and the rest of the G20, right? In terms of emission targets, in terms of financial commitments, etc., You see, that tension exists even within countries. That tension exists across cities. So putting a ceiling is, in my view, in a democratic country like ours, it can start off as a good academic exercise, but I'll tell you, eventually it will only translate into policy if we do a good job of measuring the trade-off. When we set a ceiling, what is the trade-off and what is going to be the
We
real
can
cost of
rename the
that
term
ceiling?
ceiling. We can
You know,
rename the term
I,
ceiling. The point
Sir,
I'm
I'm really
just
going
a
to
minute.
request
The
we
point I'm trying to say is that we have drone intervention in today's date, and we are going in terms of land, soil health, or maybe land allocations at the tangible level in terms of how household ownership. Looking that thing, when we have drone intervention in such a vast way, why can't we have something? The terminology in terms of ceiling can be different, but I'm saying it will give us an indication of the balance. The balance is to be maintained, and that indication is something which is relevant, which I feel.
now the quick reality check on that is the farm laws. You see, one of the biggest reasons why farm laws were also designed, they were ecological concerns as well. Water table is a very large concern in areas where energy is highly subsidized, it's almost free. And that is leading to the kind of drilling down and decline in water table at very rapid age in exactly the region where you saw very large protests. And whatever and I'm not saying it was just an academic exercise, it was very well thought out policy measures that were recommended over the last 40 years from specialists from the left and the right of the political spectrum, but they did not go through. And they did not go through is also an important, I think it's important for a room like this to recognize that we don't live in an academic world, fortunately or unfortunately. As an academic, I know we derive a lot of solace in the exercises we do, but I'm saying if we measure it adequately, keeping in mind the political economy structure within which these things have to be implemented on the ground, then we have some room that we can play with. That, let's call it ceiling, let's call it whatever you want. But if we measure the trade-offs properly, we know what the costs are going to be, and we are able to socialize that idea and communicate it broadly to people and the stakeholders, I think we have some ground to cover on that. We can definitely make some progress. Thank you.
I'm not answering your question, but I'm just sharing a few thoughts on this entire debate between development and environment. There is a perceived and a real tension, and the precedents would show, the trend of growth all over the world would show that there have been compromises that have been made. In some cases, there would be very well reasoned trade offs, and in some other cases, they may not be as well reasoned, and the decision might have tilted in one favor or the other. Uh, but I think the point that needs to be understood is that it is possible to grow without making major compromises. And I think that is central to the strategy that any country will evolve for achieving economic progress. I don't think that the debate on climate change is against growth, it's not against development. And therefore, that should be very clear. But the challenge is that how do you develop and at the same time ensure that you're not causing the damages which you're today repenting that were caused in the past. I think that's the central lesson. And therefore, I would like to share that when I was Secretary Environment, one of the industry delegations came to me and said, "Sir, we would request your ministry, the Ministry of Environment, to be business friendly." And my response to them was that yes, we will be business friendly, but business also has to be environment friendly. So I think there is a way of doing things, and at any point in time, society, governments will make trade-offs. The point is how objective and how well reasoned, how scientific those trade-offs are. For example, in many cases, there is no advocacy of having a ceiling, but for example, uh, there are studies carried out in terms of, let's say, the carrying capacity of a river. If you want to promote adventure sports, then do you carry out a carrying capacity? How much load can this stretch hold? And I do know that, For example, in the case of the river rafting in Dehradun, upstream of Rishikesh, a carrying capacity study was carried out. So similarly, in many sensitive areas, I think there have to be carrying capacity studies which draw some kind of boundaries, but those boundaries are not ceilings. I think you need to recognize that this is the extent to which this kind of development can take place in this particular zone.
Thank you so much, sir. I think we'll have to end the inaugural session here. Thank you so much to all our speakers.
One small, and I'm going to only do this because Mr. Lavasa is here. And so we have a representation from a multilateral funding agency. You know, I think there is a missing component in the global finance for this green transition. I think given the nature of the risk and the uncertainty involved, I do think the large multilateral banks will have to step up. They are the ones who can absorb some of these long-term risks, because without them, and remember, this was the reason why these were set up. They were for long-term development risks, which commercial banks were not going to take. And many times you're not going to see individual governments take it either. And I think that is the role for these institutions. So alluding again back to the finances, and that being a key constraint. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And that is a very important point to make. I really have to thank all the speakers here for a very, very enriching session.